The cold bites harder than any blade. Naked, bleeding. He's tied to a tree. His name, forgotten. His crime, unmanliness. They found him soft. He didn't speak like a warrior. He didn't fight like one. He walked with too much grace, laughed too easily, cried once. That was enough. Now his skin is torn from flogging. His groin, mutilated. Around him, men drink. They cheer. They carve runes into wood and spit curses into the wind. No one stops them. No priest. No trial. Because this is justice. A ritual. A message. To be Argr in the Viking world meant more than weakness. It meant shame. Perverted, sexual, irreversible shame. To be accused was to be condemned. This isn't just a killing. It's a erasure. A warning. In this world, a man who was not man enough was not a man at all. In Viking society, the sharpest blade was not steel. It was a word. Argr. To be called Argi was to be called passive. In sex, in life, in spirit. It meant you let another man take you, not in combat but in bed. It meant you were effeminate, cowardly, shameful, touched. And once spoken, it was a curse that demanded blood. This wasn't street gossip. It was legal. Ritualized. Men carved their accusations into wooden poles, Neufstein, then planted them outside an enemy's home. The pole was topped with a horse's head, or a grotesque carving. It spat insults into the wind, summoning shame like a storm. These weren't idle threats. These poles meant war. Blood feuds erupted, because once a man was publicly declared Argyr, he had only two choices: kill Daring, or die shamed. The nid that sparked a massacre. In Njal's saga, a man named Flosi carves a nid about his enemy's manhood, accusing him of being passive in bed. It sounds like slander, but it led to the burning of an entire household, including women and children. Dozens died. Why? Because honor, once touched by shame, had to be cleansed in blood. The insult couldn't be walked away from. If a man didn't answer violence with violence, the shame stuck to his name and passed to his sons. The curse pole that wouldn't die. In Grettir's saga, a Nogstein was raised against Grettir, a towering warrior with a reputation for violence. But the curse wasn't physical. It called him unmanly, accused him of Sayer, woman's magic. The damage was psychological. Grettir never shook the insult. He became an outlaw, paranoid, violent, Dutch, alone. He died not in battle, but poisoned, crawling through shit to escape a trap. A cursed man to the end. Words that drove men to kill. To modern ears, these insults sound almost ridiculous, but to a Viking man, they were a fate worse than death. Calling someone Argra wasn't just offensive, it was a legal provocation. According to Gragas, the Icelandic law code, if a man calls another Argar, he must be ready to fight to the death. If he doesn't, he is assumed guilty. The insult becomes true. Society turns its back. His name rots. A language of shame. There were many ways to call someone unmanly without using the word. You could say, he milks cows like a woman. He sits at the hearth instead of riding out. He dances too well. Each of these were sexual codes. They didn't just suggest softness, they suggested sexual passivity. In a world obsessed with dominance, that was the deepest cut of all. Sexual honor equals to social survival. The Viking ideal man was dominant too, aggressive, silent, unyielding in sex and war. If he wept, if he hugged another man too long, if he refused a duel, that wasn't weakness. It was proof of being Argr. This made daily life a minefield. Masculinity had to be performed at all times or risk total ruin. When families died for a word, some insults sparked generational feuds. In one saga, a man named Atli is called Argi by a rival chieftain. Rather than duel, he sends assassins. They fail. The rival responds by slaughtering Atli's sons. Atli retaliates by burning the rival's longhouse with his entire family inside. All because of one word, Argidar. This was not exceptional. It was normal. Shame required blood, or it multiplied. In Viking culture, being called unmanly wasn't a joke. It wasn't just insult. It was legal warfare. A trigger for death. A poison that could spread to children, grandchildren, even lands and alliances. And in that world, the only way to stop shame was to spill blood. When blood wasn't spilled, shame still had to be answered. And for those accused of Argr who didn't, or couldn't, fight back, exile was the next punishment. Not metaphorical. Literal. In Viking law, it was called skogangr. Going to the forest. It meant permanent banishment. You were no longer protected by law. No man was punished for killing you. You could be hunted, beaten, starved. You were as good as dead. The legal death. Gragas spells it out. He who is outlawed shall have no food, no shelter, no help from men. His name shall be struck, and his kin dishonored. Outlawry wasn't just being cast out. It was a ritual erasure of identity. A man once called brother became a ghost. If he survived at all, it was in forests or caves, scavenging like an animal. Many didn't last a year. Shaming as spectacle. Before the exile came the ritual. Public humiliation. In some cases, the accused was beaten with birch rods, naked, while villagers jeered. Sometimes his hair was shaven in patches, marked with ash. In some courts, he was forced to wear women's clothing for a day, mocked by children, scorned by elders. This wasn't justice. It was theater. The message: you are not a man. You don't belong. Mutilation as punishment. There were darker fates too. Some were mutilated, castrated, their noses or ears cut off, their mouths split. A man who was deemed beyond redemption could be marked forever. These weren't random acts. They were symbolic. Removing the genitals meant removing masculinity. Slicing the nose made a man faceless, no longer part of society. These were punishments designed to make a man into a non-person. Honor killings disguised as justice. And sometimes they didn't bother with exile. They simply killed. Legally. A man found guilty of unmanliness could be stabbed in the gut, slowly, so his insides spilled like a coward's truth. This wasn't called murder. It was called restoration of honor. The man who killed him was not punished. He was praised. Honor had been avenged. The exile of Urir. One story tells of Urir, a Norse farmer accused of seizure and cowardice. He'd refused to join a raid, said he feared the sea. Someone whispered that he spoke with spirits, that he used herbs like a woman. He was brought to the thing, the court, laughed at, cursed. No one would duel him. He wasn't worth the blade. They sentenced him to exile. He lasted one winter. His body was found half buried in snow, hands frozen in prayer. Beyond redemption. The Viking mind believed in order through shame. There was no prison, no rehabilitation. There was honor, exile, or death. If a man couldn't fight, if a man couldn't dominate, if a man didn't embody the warrior ideal, he didn't deserve protection. He was no longer part of the world. What we see here isn't just justice. It's ritualized cleansing. To the Vikings, shame was contagious. Let one unmanly man live, and soon others might question what it means to be a man. So society struck fast, and struck hard. Exile, mutilation, death. All in the name of preserving a fragile thing. Honor. Some wounds in Viking society weren't made with axes. They were made with words. The deadliest? Urgi. To call someone Argri was to accuse them of being effeminate, cowardly, and, worst of all, sexually passive. Not just an insult, a legal declaration. In the North, where survival depended on strength and dominance, Argr was the most dangerous word a man could hear. The triple curse. In Viking law and culture, Argr condemned a man on 3 levels. Sexually, he was accused of letting another man penetrate him. Socially, he was seen as disloyal, dishonorable, untrustworthy. Magically, he was often suspected of practicing seer, the woman's magic. In short, Argr meant you were no longer a man. Say it, and die. But here's the twist. If you accused a man of being Argr, and he didn't challenge you, you could kill him. No punishment, no guilt. The law was clear. Gragas, the Icelandic law code states, "He who calls another Argr, if not challenged within 3 nights, may slay him as a beast." This wasn't a metaphor. Masculinity was a kill or be killed game. Trial by combat. When accused, a man had one chance to defend his honor. Holmgang, trial by combat. He would meet his accuser in a designated field, one-on-one, with axes, spears, or swords. If he won, the insult was wiped clean. If he lost, his name, and sometimes his lineage, died with him. No defense meant guilt. If he refused the duel, if he hesitated, if he pleaded for peace, that was seen as confirmation of the insult. Silence was guilt. Mercy was weakness. The only way to be a man was to be violent. The Saga of Gloomer. In Vatnsdæla Saga, a man named Gloomer is accused of cowardice and of being Argr. He challenges his accuser to a holmgang, but Gloomer hesitates. He stalls. He looks for a way out. The insult spreads. Others begin whispering about his manhood. His status collapses. Within weeks, Gloomer is ambushed and killed. His family doesn't seek vengeance. He died not as a man, but as a disgrace. Language as a weapon. We often think of law as rules written in books, but in the Viking world, language itself was law. Argrdar Eder. Njerdini, Wadamonde. Sayamarder, Dutton. One word could end your life. Another could strip you of kinship. Words weren't just speech. They were weapons of social execution. The shame of passivity. At the core of Urgi was one belief. To be a man was to dominate. Any sign of passivity, sexual, emotional, or physical, was dangerous. Let a man weep, he may grow soft. Let a man be soft, he may become other. It was a culture where being penetrated in any way meant the loss of self. Modern echoes. Today we'd call this toxic masculinity. But back then, it wasn't just culture. It was codified law. Your gender performance could be measured, challenged, and punished. To not act like a man meant you could be stripped of your name, your kin, your life. The Law of Argr didn't just punish men for who they were. It made them fear who they might become. To survive in Viking society, you didn't just need strength. You needed to perform it. Loudly, violently, without pause. Because one word, one whisper, could become a sentence of death. Not every man in the Viking world could fight. Not every man wanted to. But in a culture built on blood and dominance, that wasn't an option. If you didn't fit the mold, didn't carry the axe, raise the sons, dominate the bed, you weren't just different. You were something else. Something dangerous. Something to be shamed or destroyed. Dwarfs in the sagas, half man, half monster. The sagas mention dwarfs, not just mythical blacksmiths or clever tricksters, but real people born small, twisted, or disabled. They weren't seen as men. They weren't seen as women. They were seen as liminal, beings who didn't belong to either world. In Hrafngal's saga, a crippled servant is mocked for being weak and womanish. He's struck in the face during a dispute, not because he spoke out, but because he dared to exist among men. To be physically different was to live on borrowed time. You were tolerated until someone needed a target. The effeminate, a walking insult. Effeminacy wasn't a personality. It was a threat. A man who spoke softly, moved delicately, or wore his hair too long, risked public mockery. In Ynglinga Saga, kings are mocked not for cowardice in battle, but for dressing too finely, singing too softly, or showing mercy. One noble is called Kona, woman, not because of what he did, but how he looked while doing it. He disappears from the saga not long after. Comic relief, or cursed object? The sagas often treat effeminate or soft men as comic characters. They slip, fall, cry too much. They beg for peace. They use words instead of weapons. And they always meet the same end. Humiliation, or death. There's no redemption arc. No second chance. To be soft in Viking culture wasn't a personality flaw, it was a deformity of the soul. Witchcraft and sire, the final insult. Soft men were often accused of sire, the woman's magic, a powerful form of prophecy and spiritual manipulation. Men who practiced it weren't feared, they were reviled. Because sire required ritual passivity, it meant the sorcerer had to submit to spirits, to gods, to visions. That submission, even metaphysical, was too close to being Argr. Even Odin, the Allfather, is mocked for it in Lokasenna. You did sire on Samsi, and beat on the drum like a witch. That was unmanly, Odin. Nilzil. If even gods could be shamed, what hope was there for a mortal man? The social cage. Viking masculinity was not just expected, it was enforced. And like any cage, it needed prisoners. Dwarfs, cripples, poets, mystics, gentle men. They became the contrast, the warning, the scapegoats. They bore the sins of a culture that demanded rage, not reason. Dominance, not dialogue. Action, not ambiguity. Egil Skallagrimsson's brother. Egil, the legendary poet-warrior, had a brother named Horolfr. He was beautiful, calm, and poetic. Everything Egil was not. The family despised him. He was sent on dangerous missions. He died young. Some scholars believe his death was a form of quiet disposal, a family restoring its masculine honor by removing its softest limb. The body was the battlefield. In this world, masculinity wasn't just about what you did, it was about what you were. Broad shoulders, strong hands, a voice that barked, not whispered. To be born different, or to choose softness, was to be guilty. No trial, no proof, just whispers and blood. The soft man was not feared in Viking society. He was ridiculed. He was bait. He was proof to others of what happened when you failed the test of masculinity. And like a wolf limping at the edge of the pack, he was left behind. In the Viking world, there was a power greater than muscle. It wasn't steel. It wasn't gold. It was Sire, a form of magic tied to prophecy, fate, and spirits. But there was one problem. Sire was a woman's art, and any man who dared to touch it was no longer a man. Sire, the forbidden power. Sire wasn't like other magic. It wasn't loud or violent or glorious. It was secret, whispered, done in trance and submission, often on one's knees. The sorcerer didn't command fate. He begged it to speak. To Vikings, this was unthinkable. A warrior stood. A man took. But Sire required you to kneel, to let the divine enter you. And that made it dangerous. Not just because it was powerful, but because it blurred the lines between man and woman. Strength and surrender. Odin, the shamed god. And yet Odin, king of the gods, lord of war and death, practiced Sire. He sought knowledge above all else. He sacrificed his eye. He hanged himself from Yggdrasil. And he knelt before the spirits. In Lokasenna, the trickster god Loki mocks him viciously. You did sire on Samsi, you beat the drum like a witch, that's woman's work. This wasn't petty insult. It was a public accusation of unmanliness. Even a god couldn't escape it. Even Odin, in all his wisdom and brutality, couldn't avoid the sting of being called Argr, the social poison of feminized power. Saidra threatened the entire Norse worldview. If a man could possess power through softness, what happened to strength? If a god could kneel and still rule, what did that say about every Viking law built on dominance? So the society reacted the way it always did. It mocked. It shamed. It killed. Men accused of practicing Seer were ridiculed. They were labeled witches. They were often mutilated, or simply vanished from the record. And women who taught it, often outcast, feared, sometimes revered, but never safe. The vulva, women who held the truth. The true practitioners of Sire were usually vulvas, female shamans who could see fate. They traveled from village to village, offering visions in exchange for food, gifts, protection. They were respected and feared, because what they did wasn't just religious. It was political. A vulva could tell you when to go to war, or when your sons would die, or that your king would fall. That power terrified men, so men stole it, quietly, shamefully, and they paid the price. The sire wands, archaeological echoes. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have found strange wands in female graves, often made of iron or bone, tipped like a staff. They are believed to be sire tools, buried with their owners, never passed on, as if the magic itself had to die with them, because knowledge, when feminized, became threat. And in Viking culture, threat had to be silenced. The fear of the passive male body. Why was sire so hated in men? Because it required passivity, openness, vulnerability, all things Norse masculinity feared. The warrior conquered. He didn't receive. But in Sire, the body became a vessel. The sorcerer was entered by spirits, by fate, and the metaphor was too close to what they feared most. The unmanly man. The man who was taken. Not the man who took. Magic wasn't the threat. Gender was. This wasn't about belief. Vikings believed in spirits, in gods, in visions. They welcomed prophecy, as long as it came in a masculine voice. But once power came wrapped in softness, it became corruption. The same fear that made them kill soft men, made them hate magical ones. The same laws that punished cowardice, punished spiritual surrender. Even the gods weren't safe. Even Odin, with his wisdom and his ravens and his endless war, was mocked for kneeling. Because in this world, nothing was more terrifying than a man who didn't obey the code, who didn't dominate, who didn't fight. The sorcerer became the scapegoat, the prophet, the pervert. And in the end, Viking masculinity wasn't just a law. It was a spell you broke at your own peril. When the blood dried, when the bodies were buried, when the last curse pole rotted in the wind, one thing remained: silence. A silence thick with fear, rules, and unspoken truths. Because in the Viking world, manhood wasn't just a role. It was a cage. Honor written in flesh. You were born male. But that didn't make you a man. You had to prove it, live it, bleed for it. And if you failed, you weren't just mocked. You were erased. One slur, one whispered insult, one carved pole in the ground, and your entire existence could collapse. Argr, unmanly. Less than nothing. It didn't matter how many men you'd killed, how many children you'd fathered, how many raids you'd returned from with gold and blood. If someone called you soft, and you didn't answer with a sword, your life was already over. Masculinity is law, not identity. In Viking culture, gender was not fluid. It wasn't even personal. It was legal, enforced, punished. Who you were mattered less than what you did, and how others saw you. Were you dominant? Aggressive? Capable of violence? Then you were safe. But if you danced instead of fought, if your voice was soft, if you wept, or healed, or dared to kneel, you weren't just different. You were dangerous. To them. To the order. To the myth of manhood. The legacy of fear. We like to believe we've moved on. That the fears of the past, the shame, the rules, the rituals, belong to another world. But look closer. How many men today still hide behind silence? How many young boys are taught to fight before they're allowed to cry? How many insults, coward, weak, feminine, still carry the weight of violence? The Viking curse didn't die with the sagas. It just changed languages. Now it's locker room talk, online threats, political dog whistles, a constant gnawing pressure to perform masculinity, or risk humiliation. What makes a man? Is it dominance, rage, control, or is it endurance? Wisdom, kindness under pressure? The Vikings believed power had one shape: male, violent, hardened by blood and fire. But their gods betrayed that myth. Odin practiced Sirur. Loki changed sex. Thor dressed as a bride. Even in their stories, the line was never clean. And maybe that's the truth they feared most. That identity, real human identity, is messy. Not a sword to be brandished, but a burden to be understood. A culture that ate its own. The Viking obsession with masculine purity didn't make their society stronger. It made it fragile. It turned shame into fuel, law into murder, ritual into trauma. It made brother turn on brother, father disown son. Communities cast out the very people who might have healed or taught or saved them, because they couldn't fit a mold forged in fear. So we return one last time to that man tied to the tree. Was he a sorcerer? A healer? A quiet boy who didn't fight back when mocked? We don't know. His name is lost, but his story, his punishment, lives on in every boy told to man up, every man too afraid to show softness, every law that still demands conformity over compassion. That tree stands in every age. And the rope? We tie it ourselves, again and again. To ask what makes a man is not weakness. It's courage, because the real danger, in Viking times and now, isn't softness. It's silence.